everybody. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'd like to start first with our land acknowledgement. So we are hosting today on the traditional territory and unsurrendered land of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat's people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We are also acknowledging that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still a home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work here on this land. I think it's also very important to note with the recent news about the mass grave findings of the Indigenous children underneath the residential schools in Kamloops, BC, British Columbia. I think it's important to note this and very unfortunate that it takes tragedies like these to remind us how important it is that we support and stand with our Indigenous people and support their rights. So I hope to take this moment to also think about how you can support Indigenous people here. And as well, there is a march, the Bring Our Children Home March, on Sunday, happening at 2 p.m. starting at Queen's Park, is one way you can join in and stand in solidarity with Indigenous folks. Just make sure you wear a mask and physically distance yourself as well. With that, thank you everyone for joining us here today at ACAST's Q&A for the Sexplanation with the Filmmakers. Thank you all again. This is being recorded and we are live streaming it to YouTube on the ACAST channel. If you do not want to be featured in the recording, you can always turn off your camera just to make sure that you're not in the recording if that you don't want to be. You will be able to use the chat box to ask any of your questions. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host for tonight, our very special Tony Tran. He is an actor, a writer, and a lover of Vietnamese coffee, whose work often explores comedy and queer Asian intersections. Through his projects, Tony aims to create and star in his very own scripted television series and create space for Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQ plus artists. So with that, let's have a very big welcome to Tony Tran.
Oh my God, that's me, Tony Tran. Hi, thank you, Ryan, for having us. Thank you, guys, for this lovely Q&A, and thank you, the Sexplanation team, for coming to talk to us about sex and sexual health and shame. If we want to get into that, we get deep there. But let me just introduce to our lovely filmmakers. So Alex Liu here, Alexander Liu, has a passion for telling compelling stories that blend education, advocacy, and entertainment that led him to Fine Hair Productions in 2012. Since then, he's developed 2 award-winning YouTube channels focused on sex and drug education, totaling over 5 million views. After studying molecular toxicology at UC Berkeley and science, health, and environmental reporting at New York University, that's a school, he produced video, radio, and print content for Nova Science Now, CNN Health, and San Francisco NPR station KQED. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and now we have Leo Neri. You prefer Leo or Leonardo?
Leo's fine.
Leo's cool. So Leo's a tinkerer of ideas, words, and narratives with a creative background in marketing and branding. Leo has helped develop brands such as Google Maps, Google Street View, YouTube, Uber, and more. Basically everything we use. Whether it's campaign work, video production, or brand development, a through line in Leo's work is a combination of playful and pragmatic. Leo studied environmental policy at UC Berkeley, and he also enjoys reasonable length walks on the beach, but only if it's overcast or nighttime. This is very right. So good to meet you two, and I'm so excited about talking about this documentary. And why don't we start off tell us about the process of making this documentary. You went all over the world. What was it like? How did you find the people you interviewed?
You want to start, Leah?
Alex, I think you should start with.
Well, okay, yeah. I mean, basically, this project was born out of the kind of simmering, resentment I still have about my sex education, my coming out process when I was a kid, right? So, I came out relatively early, but as I started to study and come out and learn more about human sexuality, it became just so clear very quickly how the research and the education was out there. It just wasn't being taught. And I didn't understand why. And through this kind of research, I realized it's because, at least in America, I'm not quite sure how it's done in Canada, but it sounds like there's also it's a political decision, right? Elected officials have to decide what gets taught in schools. And if you campaign on a platform of let's teach homosexuality is normal, that anal sex is normal and pleasurable, that it's okay to have crazy fantasies, that's not a winning political campaign, right? That's so easy to tar and feather, and no one's going to win that campaign. So these things just don't get taught. And I was just so angry at this that so many people like me were suffering, and the information was out there, the curriculum was already developed. So I figured no one's doing it. I kind of have a science and health reporting background, a science background. Why don't I try to do it? And why don't I try to, the project initially just became like, let's just throw out all the cool, interesting sex facts out there. But as I was making it, and this is kind of when Leo came in, it soon became clear that what I was doing was filming a lot of interesting interviews, but I wasn't putting together a real story, a real narrative arc. Right. And Leo, when he kind of started learning about the project, learning about it, he was great to push me in terms of like telling my own personal story. Even though, ostensibly it's my story, Leo and I sat for many, many hours talking about both of our, coming out process, what it was like to learn about sex. And from there, we knew we had to, it became clear that the story really was about shame, right? It really was about sexual shame and the story of how do you, if you start from deep-seated shame, how do you actually end up letting go of that shame? Because it's so difficult, right? And so, yeah, we basically knew we needed to talk about porn. We needed to talk about religion, psychology, biology. And so Leo and I kind of, it's been great to kind of find these experts, interview them. So many of them are willing to talk because, they know this information to get out there. Leo and I sat down and came up with all the questions. Leo pushed me really hard to ask really divulge personal things about myself, really get deep and like, what are we actually asking? And then after about 4 years of filming experts, after they kind of were hearing the same thing over and over and over again, we realized we started to edit. And now it's just a process. So maybe you can take from here, Leo, but just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. We'll probably have 15 cuts of the movie and 200 pages of writing. And it really, it's 80 minutes and probably, 10 pages of narration. So it was a big iterative process.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting exercise to kind of delve into a topic that could be very sad. And it was, for everyone that I'm assuming watched the movie, we kind of delve into Alex's personal story. And there are some really dark moments about confronting, your own sexuality and what that means in the context of a society that usually rejects any deviation from our cookie cutter preset sexuality. So finding the levity and the humor and the human story, it was like such a welcome endeavor to try to engage an audience with something that could be depressing and try to make it light and approachable and something that we should all, a worthy exercise that we should all embark on. So that was a really, really fun creative exercise. Yeah.
If there's anything you laughed at or found humorous or funny, probably Leo had a big hand in making that happen because he's just such a wordsmith.
I love it. Let's hop into the talk of family. In the early parts of the documentary, Alex, you dove right into your family, and I was wondering, do you still talk about sex with your family? And Leo, do you have any experience talking about sex with your family as well?
I wouldn't say it's a topic that comes up a lot. But I think what's been interesting about this process is this was kind of like the last taboo that we never talked about as a family. And bringing that up, I think, opened up just more like deeper emotional connection, right? That these things that we tiptoed around, we don't feel like we need to anymore. We have boundaries, of course, but that I feel just so much safer and then just kind of more connected to my parents, because I feel like if I do have a question, I want to ask them about sex. Like, what's it like getting older to have sex? What's it like being in a long-term relationship having sex? That's something I don't feel like I could come to them and talk to them about, because they clearly have no problems talking about that with me. That's very individual to my family, but that's been great. So I think, the best part about this whole process is now I see my parents much more as friends, like as humans, rather than kind of a mythical parent figure, that our relationship, and it's all incremental, right? It's step by step, conversation by conversation. But it feels like the relationship is growing and deepening in ways that it didn't, in the 10 years before we started talking about this.
Yeah, I'd say similarly, I'll take like an anecdotal, I have a relationship with my mother where it was a very, I don't know if I want to say traditional, but it's very like baseline. Are you okay? Yes. How are you? Fine. Is there anything that I should be worrying about? And I think as I've gotten older, I've learned to kind of scratch beneath the surface, and identifying as queer. I have this one interaction that really stood out where I'm like, I came out to my mother when I was 18, and she'd never, for me, it was like this huge, for both of us, it was like a pretty big event to kind of have that exchange and for her to confront what that meant for me growing up. But then after we had that initial conversation for years, there was we never talked about it afterwards. And I in the depths of my like angsty college depression, I remember lashing out at my mother, asking her, I brought this thing up to you years ago and you've never once thought to ask. And I feel like that kind of broke her heart that I confronted her like really directly. So I think ever since, she's always just been very proactive in asking me if like, I'm like, you're still single, right? I'm like, yeah, I am, Mom. Just making sure, how are you? Are you okay? Or whenever I date someone, she's like, is he good? Is he nice to you? Is he kind?
Aww.
And similarly, I have that exchange with my mom. I'm like, in not so many words, I'm like, are you getting laid? I hope you're getting laid. She's divorced. I'm like, just trying to check in on testing the boundaries of comfort, but making sure that we kind of touch that aspect of our humanity that usually gets overlooked between parent and kid.
For sure. On the topic of, because we are ACAS and we are Asian focused, I was wondering, do you think your parents were exceptional in this conversation, or do you think other Asian parents would be open to talking about sex?
That's a good question, because you're right. I can only speak from personal experience about, and I will say, like in my little community where I grew up in the Bay Area, when I came out, I was one of the few Asian kids who came out, and slowly kind of through the grapevine, when other kids now in the community come out, the parents are sent to my parents as like the first stop to talk, to get through that level of acceptance, because it is a conversation I think not many Asian families are having per se, compared to maybe say some other communities. And I think but part of the reason why I think that Leo and I were drawn to talking about our family, presenting our family, is to kind of show a different model, right? To show, often it's people are so, every type of person, but I think, especially germane to the Asian community, it's, because we're such a small minority, we want to make sure we fit in. We want to make sure we're normal. We don't want to stand out in any way, because we stand out already so much. And I think maybe there is just kind of a more communal culture in many Asian cultures that sticking out is a bit of a taboo. But showing that an example of that this can actually be a way to become closer, is something that we hope we can do. But again, it's so dependent on the family, so dependent on that individual circumstance. I will say, in some of the people who are Asian who have come to us after seeing the movie, they had very similar experiences in terms of my father saying, we were just waiting for you to come to us. We have no problem with it, but and I think a lot of parents of all different backgrounds feel similarly, right? It's they were never told by their parents, so they don't know how to talk about it to their kids, and they're not opposed to that conversation per se, but no one is broaching the subject. And so I think, as much as you can, I've come a long way in terms of forgiving my parents, in terms of things that are not really about blame, but then, at this point, this moment, if that's something you want, maybe it's all baby steps, right? So something that hopefully we can all be a little bit better at, and something that I hope that, all communities, I think, can start to work towards.
And hopefully it's like generationally, hopefully it's getting better as it becomes more of just common culture and people become more accepting of it. So hopefully it's an easier path going forward.
Now, I will say, I think Korean dramas are actually doing a big part in terms of they presenting gay characters. I think that's been big.
But not sex, in my experience watching K-drama.
No, not sex. Yeah. Baby steps. It's all baby steps.
So in the documentary, you talked a lot about sex, but what particularly stood out to me, as we mentioned earlier, was the topic of shame. And so shame for me, at least in my experience as an Asian, it talks about like saving face. We don't talk about sex because it's embarrassing. We want to be like a clean model minority or whatever you have to say about it. So super generalized, but what do you think the Asian community, at least in the Western hemisphere, are we particularly repressed in terms of sex? Should we be having more sex? Less?
Well, we should be having as much sex as we want to be having, right? Like that. I think we're also individual in that sense. And I would say, other than I would say like Scandinavia, Germany, Northern European countries, most countries are pretty bad about a sexual shame. What I'm worried really much more about is how Asian people, especially Asian men, are presented in Western culture. I think often desexualized, asexualized, like almost like anti-sexual in many ways. And I worry much more about Asian male mental health in terms of, do we see ourselves as sexy? Do we see ourselves as sexual beings? Do we see ourselves as worthy of all the sex we want to have? My whole lifetime I've heard that I just don't, some version of I just don't find Asian men attractive, right? So I think for me, in the Western hemisphere at least, that is my biggest concern, and something that I hope that we can start talking more about, because I think that's the first step to try to change things. And things are changing very quick, though, maybe just in the last couple of years.
For sure.
Yeah. And then
go for it. Go. No,
I was just going to say, on the flip side of that coin, on the binary spectrum, like we have Asian women being hypersexualized, and the whole other slate of problems that comes with, which is probably too long for this conversation, but yeah.
So the reason I asked this question was to lead to the more important question for me, is how do you deal with shame if let's say one of your kinks, or you fall into a sexual stereotype? How would you address that?
Even if you fit the stereotype?
Yes, for example, for cis gay Asian men, a lot of stereotypes that they're submissive and violence, et cetera. How would you? And there's sometimes shame in that. How would you address that?
I feel that for sure. To be honest, I think seeking help is probably the first step. Getting a good cognitive behavioral therapist for me was groundbreaking, life-changing in terms of how I understood my thought processes, how much of the shame I was experiencing but not acknowledging. I think it's a lifetime of work to understand that, to unpack it, and it'll probably be always part of your imprinting. But understanding how you can make sure that the way you move through life doesn't put you in situations that are going to be demeaning, right? I think another part of it for me has always been around consent, right? That if I'm in a situation where I feel uncomfortable because the person is not seeing me as a human being, but as a stereotype or an object, and And that's not something I want in that moment. You know, I think being objectified is great in many moments, but sometimes that's not what you want. And just being very clear about how do you communicate that. And if those needs that you're communicating are not being met, being able to stop a situation and understand that you always have that right.
Mm-hmm. Leo, any experiences with stereotypes?
Experiences with stereotypes?
Or like managing stereotypes and like sexual shame regarding stereotypes that one might fall into.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky thing to try to separate what is actually coming from you and what is something that's being projected onto you that you're projecting back. So yeah, I don't think there's an easy way out of having like a very tiring like you're having to do constant inventory of who are you really. And I think that's something that honestly it's applicable to kind of all our facets of existing as sexual beings and humans.
Yeah, and I would say though, conversations like these, being able to listen when other people are talking about it, being able to hear how other people experience this kind of stuff, you know, any ways that you can start to connect and work within a community that's trusting, loving, safe, to kind of figure out strategies to manage this, I think has been also a big part of how I've, you know, been able to feel healthy.
Yes, like sexual health communities like ACAS, who's hosting this. This is a plug-in. Thank you so much. It was so let's get a bit personal. I want to ask, how did you discover your own sexuality? You both mentioned you came out to families. I want to ask, how did you discover your own sexuality? What was it like? And what was your first time masturbating like? And how did that happen?
You say your first time masturbating?
You want to go? You want to go, Leo? I feel like if you've seen the movie, you know that story for me.
Well, with the question, what was the last question that you asked?
So these are several questions I clumped together.
Yeah.
What was your discovery of your own sexuality like? For example, and also, what was your first time masturbating like, and how did that happen? I feel like that's the first step for most people of discovering sexuality.
I mean, I really I knew I was gay pretty early on. It maybe like before puberty, I think I already knew I was attracted to boys. But like one thing that's really seared in my brain was I think maybe like in like fifth grade. So I was about what grade? How old is that? Like 10, something like that. Around 10 years old. There was a I still remember who he is. There's a boy who's you know, pretty effeminate, I guess, by 90 standards for a grade school boy. And I remember him being made fun of, and my first my reaction to that was, oh, I'm glad it's not me. So like some reaction to like, oh, I'm like somehow able to hide. And there's like another target that's standing in the way of me catching like fire from people targeting this poor kid for just acting, you know, how he naturally feels, and that is read as queer. So I think that is very much intertwined with the idea of shame. So shame is very much a part of like my realization that I am queer. And then my first time, I don't remember my first time masturbating. I do remember the first time getting a boner. I think it was to a day talk show. I think they happened to have like hot bodied men. And I remember getting so freaked out that I had an erection that I almost like cried and went to my mom to ask like what was going on, because I did not know what my body was doing.
Of course.
I did not go to my mother. Looking back, I'm kind of glad I didn't. But yeah, both of these things kind of tied with like shame, not knowing, lack of information, and like not even like physiologically knowing what was happening to my body. Yeah.
I mean, I think, I remember playing with my body, playing with my penis, not having any context around what was happening, thinking it was like a fun party trick that you can get erect or hard and then not. Though I think very quickly, you know, I think going through puberty, I just remember thinking I was gay, not sure what that meant, but unclear about how men had sex with each other, right? It made no sense to me. But, I think for those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s, HIV/AIDS was just so prevalent and present. And I knew somehow that gay men were more prone to that. But also, as I was going through puberty, the internet was taking off. So that was just, very quickly, you can go online, read some things and understand immediately, yes, I like this. This is how gay men have sex. Porn was a way to understand what it meant to be gay for me. And then just being incredibly, incredibly ashamed around that whole. So it's a whole cycle of just, learning how to touch myself and masturbate and orgasm and learning what all these things were through porn. And just knowing that the porn I was watching was something that if I was to be discovered would mean a whole host of issues that I wasn't prepared to deal with. Right. So it was a total mind fuck in terms of understanding my body. And I think for my entire life, I probably will have that kind of conditioning around my body. Those feelings, I think, will never go away, but I'm able to recognize them a lot quicker and manage them a lot quicker so that it doesn't become a real problem in any way now. But it's really only until my 30s, I think, that I have been able to fully express publicly what I want and then try to make sure I have a life where I can get as much as I want. You never get 100% of what you want, but more in the position that's aligned to who I am, my body, and everything there.
Amazing. Since making this documentary, I want to ask you both: has your personal sex lives changed? Has it changed? Is my question. You can say you don't have to.
I would say in a weird, surprising way, I now see sex in a much more sacred, spiritual way. That's not to say that I'm like making distinction. Not to say that I like have less sex or I'm less slutty or whatever it is, right? It's that I find that my sluttiness also has to be paired with my spiritual kind of needs, right? So if a person maybe is hot and wants to have sex, but they feel like a toxic person, it's just not worth it to me, right? Where in the past, I think, maybe probably because I was dealing with a lot of just kind of trauma around being gay, I would have just jumped at the first chance, right? That validation I was seeking so much that even if it was bad for me, I would still enter those situations. So I think I'm a lot more just thoughtful around who I decide to share myself with, and that making sure that the situations I find myself in, promote a sense of health and well-being and get to actually be fun and playful rather than kind of just more transactional.
Yeah, I think being more unapologetic with wants, needs, or just like realities of embodying a sexual vessel. It's like, even as far as like, if you have like an STI scare, or if I have an STI scare, like not being like, it's like a human process that we all at some point may encounter, but there's so much shame that's loaded into like the social like shame of having a STI, but it's like, a common cold. So just being more frank, even just with my immediate circle of like friends, about if something comes up, or talking about our kinks, or talking about not being ashamed about like having sex, or just opening up the conversation. I think I've been a little bit more confident in being just fully there. But again, that's another one of those, like, you have to constantly check yourself. And when you do withhold, I think I'm catching myself when I am withholding and why I'm withholding and what that means. So just, again, the constant inventory and checklist that you're running through in your head.
Yeah, and I think also, if you see the film, you kind of see how we try to deconstruct and think and reconstruct a definition of what sex even is. And I think that's been so helpful for me in seeing the sexual beauty in everyone and seeing kind of the how I'm sexual with people in ways that have nothing to do with physical pleasure, have nothing to do with intercourse or orgasm, but everything to do with pleasurable human connections, conversations, compliments, that sort of thing, and recognizing that it's a much broader kind of playground, and we're all a part of it, whether we like it or not. So might as well lean into it rather than be afraid of it and always trying to kind of repress it.
Yeah, lean in, lay down.
Many different positions. Let's lean into that. So when I watched the documentary, I did start to question, like, oh my God, what is sex? Phone sex, sexting, sex. You don't have to like touch someone to have sex. So for a lot of bisexual experience, sex was always tied to achieving orgasm or attempting to achieve it. So can you both tell us more about different sexual acts you came across outside of, like, the traditional penetration? You spoke about it a bit.
Yeah, I think now about like a pat on the back, or complimenting someone's outfit, or just taking the time if there's someone who I really care about and love. Maybe we're not like romantic sexual partners, but part of who I am as a sexual being is, tending to all my relationships and making sure the people who I find beauty in and who I love, I make sure I express that, in a way that makes sure that we maintain a connection, right? Because I think about sex much more broadly in terms of connected, pleasurable human experiences, whatever form that might take. And so now, it's a continual process. It's kind of a little disorienting in terms of how everyone in our culture conceptualizes sex, but realizing now that it's something that we learn very early on to hide and repress, especially when it's like male on male, right? I worry a lot about straight men who like never hug or never cuddle, at least with gay men, like I'm very affectionate with my gay male friends. And there's a sexual component to that, but it's nothing to be afraid of, and in the past I kind of maybe was more afraid of that.
Leo, anything?
I guess a couple things that came up as Alex was speaking was in the movie we have like these two, Father Godfrey,
yes,
again speaking about just connection as a sexual, it's a sexual experience, like any kind of connection you have with a lowercase s, capital S, right? And Kristen Gilbert from UBC. If you her awesome speech about what it means to be a sexual person. So
yes,
the idea of what we're projecting out into the world and how we want to be seen, how you laugh, how you wear your hair, how you move through the world. So this idea of like sex and sexuality being obviously an act of connection, but then also from us, what we're emanating in that connection is what we're projecting and, how we're projecting. So beyond just the scope of like fluids and penetration, like all of these other workings that are happening that are just boiled down to being a human being again.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking the same. What's a harmonica job?
You just think about harmonica. Just think of that. You're going to use your imagination in terms of.
Okay.
What?
Thank you, Ryan, for sharing that. Okay. Sorry, I was about to say I think we're not thinking of the same instructor in the documentary, but that moment about sexuality is humanity. I think I teared up. Actually, it was beautiful.
Oh, the whole room was tearing up. We were all tearing up when we heard that.
Oh my God.